Issues give you focus. With greenfield, your kind of scope is
Right.
infinite. The challenge also, like you say, was every other part of the organisation was also going through that process
of course,
trying to define what it is they wanted their part of the organisation to look like. You need to be able to balance the costs associated with that, particularly when you have no customers, right?
Of course.
You want to keep your costs
obviously.
very low, so you have to be smart.
Hi, Gary. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Can you start by introducing yourself and explaining to us a bit like what was your career before you and what was your role at Zand as well?
Sure. So I've got 20 years in what I would describe as kind of core data management practice. Originally from the UK, as you can probably tell by the accent, based largely in Edinburgh. My background is predominantly financial services.
Okay.
So I worked in banks, insurance companies for my entire career. When I first got into data management, I actually joined what was Bank of Scotland back in Edinburgh. They were realistically trying to build up what is now kind of known as a single customer view. So they were going through that kind of transformation program where kind of traditional banking practices, which were very kind of branch focused, you know, your bank manager knew every piece of information about you, and you know that's how business was done, right? They were moving to much more kind of centralized back office, middle office operations, centralizing things for both efficiencies and kind of control across the organisation. And this was also on the back of a lot of kind of mergers and acquisitions within the kind of banking sector as well. So there was a lot of kind of legacy parts to the organisation, and by trying to centralise things, they found that you as a customer might exist in multiple different databases, which made it particularly hard to understand what your kind of exposure was to any one customer at that time. And that was really what the regulators were kind of worried about as well, rightfully so, it turned out, when the kind of financial crisis happened. And that's when they kind of really understood that banks really didn't have a handle on their kind of internal processes and information that was being kind of used across the organisation. So a lot of the roles that I had within the bank focused on those types of activities was getting data in a fit shape, consolidating it across multiple sources, bringing legacy parts of the organisation together into a more refined source of information.
Okay.
That kind of progressed. So, like I say, I got to see many different aspects of the organisation. So moving on from kind of building that single customer view, there was then different parts of the organisation that were wanting to build similar things. Now, that's, a bit of a, kind of difference in kind of, you can't say you've got a single customer view and then you've got multiple single customer views, but that was how it kind of started. I managed to kind of make my way around various parts of the organisation, spent some time in Spain, spent some time in the States, working with the different parts of the business, all on similar kind of programs. So what is now known master data management, reference data management, data quality, all became suddenly really big initiatives within the organisation. And it was also at the time where kind of organisations were starting to realise that this wasn't just a tech problem, and the data part of that was coming out of technology and sitting almost bridging between the business and technology, which is kind of where things sit now, where organisations really have predominant data functions. So they were starting to get that into that mindset of, data is not a tech problem. It's really something that the business understand. Technology have, their own problems to deal with, and from an infrastructure and application perspective. But data really needs a very specific set of skills to manage properly. So, like I say, for me, it was a very good time to be starting those practices. And I got to see a lot of mistakes being made, a lot of good things happening, and a lot of where organizations have challenges. So that I think I spent maybe 7 years within that group of companies. So there was a number of kind of mergers, and the group then became Lloyds Banking Group, which still one of the largest banks in the UK. Leaving there, I decided that I'd built up kind of all these good practices. I did some kind of independent consultancy after that. Then I was approached by FGB, which is UAE Bank, now FAB. Again, very, very similar kind of use case. They were having massive challenges with just understanding what data they had across the organization. And their kind of trigger point for that was they were trying to build a kind of data warehouse. So they were getting into the stage of trying to do more kind of business intelligence analytics. And they were finding that the data was a mess, and they weren't able to leverage or get any of the kind of returns that they were expecting. Right?
How long ago was this?
This was back in 2013.
Okay, yeah. 10 years ago.
So it was really a kind of recurrence of some of the challenges that I was experiencing in the UK, Europe were maybe slightly ahead of the game, which is often the case. I think that's maybe changed slightly now, and I think a lot of organisations out here are really accelerating
that's true.
the kind of innovation and side of things, and have the kind of ability to move a little bit faster. So FGB at the time, like I say, we're trying to build out that kind of analytics and business intelligence side of their strategy, and we're really struggling with just the fundamentals of where data is in the organisation. Both from a kind of business organisational perspective and technology, right? The challenges on both sides. So I basically came out and helped set up the governance data management practice within FGB, and then stayed with them through their merger with NBAD to become Fab. Similarly, reset the program, and kind of you're then focusing on bringing two legacy organizations together to create a new organization, and all the kind of challenges that come with that. Then more recently, so 5 years ago, I was approached by at the time was a secret project.
Yeah, I remember
that. Which sounded very, very exciting. It was a chance to basically build a bank, a digital-only bank from scratch. So, it sounded like a fantastic opportunity to do something, as a greenfield. So for the last 5 years, I was with Zand, who are a digital-only bank based out of Dubai. So again, very, very similar in terms of like building up from scratch, albeit without the kind of legacy side of the organisation, and making sure that the organisation was in a good position to leverage data as an asset.
It's very interesting because you went through, you worked in like huge companies with a lot of data. You arrived, it was a mess, as you said, and you had to basically work on like, how do we structure this, all the challenges that you have in this type of companies, and as well as Zand, in general, in this type of projects that are like, okay, let's build a company from scratch. And so you can start with best practices, but you have no data, no legacy. So very, very different challenges. Can you tell us a bit more about like how you approached, especially the one that is, with Zand actually like starting from scratch with nothing. So maybe just for everyone to understand, the bank was launched like what, 3-4 years ago?
Yeah, so we started...
Was live, for customers.
Yeah, we started 5 years ago, and obviously being a new bank, the challenge was getting a banking license right, to operate.
Obviously.
So there was a period of time to go through that process of getting the banking license, and then like you say, they've been live to the market for the last kind of 3 years.
3 years, okay, so it's very recent. So basically you spent a bit of time working with no customers, so no customer data, zero legacy, and as we were saying, like everyone in the company was actually starting from scratch. So I would love if you could like just explain to us a bit, like you were recruited. I think your title was like Head of Data Enablement, if I'm not mistaken. So what was your role? How do you start in this type of situation with nothing?
Yeah, it's an interesting experience, and I think it's a unique one that not many people get to kind of to take on. And I think, generally as a data practitioner, you're usually coming into an organization at the point where they've realized that they have a problem, right? So, you're coming into an organization that, have recognized that they have an issue, and your mandate is to be very clear, right? It's how do we solve these problems? With a kind of greenfield, it's very different. You don't have problems because you don't have you don't have data.
Yeah, but at least it was, I guess, a no-brainer for them to have a data entity, like people starting from.
So I think that's the positive side of it, is that when you're in a kind of startup, you're very focused in terms of, we understand what we need to do, right? We don't need to worry about legacy, so we can be very focused on what we want to do correctly. But the other challenge is that sometimes issues give you focus, right? So you're very targeted on. We're looking at this piece. With greenfield, your kind of scope is infinite, right?
Of course.
And I think a lot of the time you can get into a kind of cycle where you start to kind of second guess yourself, and you start to over-engineer things, and with time comes a lot of imagined problems, and you're trying to plan for the future. So you're trying to make sure that the organization's set up for future growth, and as well as being able to kind of manage the immediate task, which for us was getting the banking license, right? So a lot of what we were focusing on at the start was building up a kind of blueprint that we could take to the central bank and say, this is what we're doing, and build that credibility and trust between us and the regulator to say, hey, we know what we're talking about, and we're going to be able to meet your obligations, and we're going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. The challenge also, like you say, was every other part of the organisation was also going through that process of trying to define what it is they wanted their part of the organisation to look like, which again makes it difficult from a data perspective, because you don't have a full set of
You're not even sure about what you're going to get. And
exactly. So you're trying to plan for things that are still evolving. So that can be, quite a difficult thing to manage. And, our default position was really trying to take a more principled approach for things.
Okay.
So not trying to set things in stone immediately. Take a kind of step back and say, look, from a principle perspective, what is it we're trying to do? What is it the business are trying to do? What is it, the central bank expects from us? And be able to kind of translate that into a set of capabilities that we could build towards, regardless of what technology was being implemented, or what that actually looked like from an implementation perspective. But get it right in our heads in terms of what the principles and our kind of target state looked like.
There was some expectation from the central bank, on this side as well. Like you had to show that you had the right data foundations to, store the data securely. These are part of the requirements, or it has nothing to do with the type of things?
Yes and no. I think there was elements of that. Obviously, you're building an application for a banking license. You need to show that it's secure. And, so even if they didn't ask for it explicitly, it was good to have something that you can talk around. Obviously, from a regulator perspective, regardless of whether we're a new bank or not, we're expected to be able to meet the obligations that any bank in the UAE is able to do. So, having experience working with a regulated bank in the UAE already gave me a pretty good understanding of what the expectations are, right? So the set of reporting that you need to be able to give back to the central bank is fairly standard, right? It doesn't.
And you knew it, so
that's also, I guess, part of the challenge of having that kind of startup stage as well, where you, although you're very small and you don't have any customers, and the expectations on you are still the same as if you were a large, well-established organization, right? Capability-wise, you need to be able to do the same things. The challenge you have is that you're probably expected to do the same things with a much smaller resource pool, right? I think we eventually, when we got our banking license, we were around 100 people, which, to build a bank is pretty impressive, right?
Yeah, it's quite big.
Compared to, an organization that I came from had 5,000-6,000.
Oh, you mean 100 people within the data team?
Not within the data team, within the organization completely.
Okay.
I wish we had 100 people.
Yeah, I was very surprised. But still it's big for a company that's being launched.
Yeah. I mean, from a data function, we were very small, and I think that's the other challenge you have is that you need to be able to balance the kind of costs associated with that, particularly when you have no customers, right?
Of course.
You want to keep your costs very low, so you have to be smart and do more with less. So I think that is another challenge that you have. So whether that's augmenting with vendor resources or you need to be a little bit smarter and
you're at an investment stage, so
and
everything
I think that, things like that built naturally into what we were trying to design from a data perspective as well, right? We needed something that is able to scale with the business, both up and down, right? But it meant we could take some, like you say, some best practice approaches to things, and particularly coming from legacy organizations, where some of the mistakes can be made, right?
Of course.
We could apply a lot of good principles in ensuring
to avoid
that
making mistakes that from
and don't get me wrong, right? There's no perfect formula, right? You're always going to make mistakes,
of course.
And I think if you're not making mistakes, you're not really pushing the boundaries. If you're going to be safe, then that's one thing, but you're not really pushing the boundaries, and you need to be playing in that space if you want to kind of innovate.
Yeah, makes sense. But it's very interesting. So what I want to deep dive into with you is basically discuss so we talked about Zand. It can be any company. Like you start a new business from scratch. The plus for you was that it's very regulated. There is a big challenge of security. We can come back to it. But in general, your job is basically to come and create the data team. I mean, to enable everything related to data. So how do you start? You build a sort of, in general, you build a sort of strategy. You start by the foundations, I believe, to put together a good architecture, to imagine some use cases. Is the objective when you launch to be ready with a lot of personalization services? How do you actually start? Because as you said, it's so broad, you can do everything. So how do you manage to...
And I think maybe one thing we didn't touch on previously was the concept of enablement, rather than historically... My focus was very much governance. And I think mindset-wise, I think you're seeing a lot more focus from a data management perspective on that enablement side of things. Again, it's as all roles are in the data space, they're evolving, right? And they're changing over time. I think personally, from my perspective, where the focus was originally on governance, coming out of a kind of regulation where, like I say, the stick rather than the carrot was very much the kind of driving force for a lot of things. So that kind of top-down governance model was traditionally how things started. It's something that's not particularly sat well with me. I'm much more pragmatic.
Okay.
And I think for me, government or data governance didn't really give the right feel in terms of what we needed to be doing as a practitioner for the organization, right? I think governance very much gives the impression that you're a policeman, right? And that's often how it's described, right? You're policing data and telling people what they can and can't be doing, and you're the bad guy, right? And that's not what I want it to be, right? I don't think that's good for the organization. Either, yes, there are certain times where you need to be very stringent in terms of how things are happening, but for me, it conflicts with that kind of methodology of data being an asset. Right? To be an asset, it needs to be used by as many people in the organization as possible.
Yeah, you need to convince people that your project and whatever you set up and you put in place is actually exciting. And so if you keep being the bad cop, it's the adoption.
But it also adds friction to the organization.
Exactly,
I think,
course.
That's something that is never an easy sell. It's never something that people want to take on board, right? So if you're coming along and saying, look, we've got all these new policies and standards for how data needs to be managed, and you now can't do this, you now can't do that, you now can't do this, right? You now need to do this if you want to do this. You're immediately going to fail, right?
Yeah.
All that happens, and I think Tom Redmond makes a good analogy of calling it a kind of, you end up creating hidden data factories. Whereas you're trying to do the opposite. You're trying to make things more transparent and more kind of explainable across the organization. But if you're adding too much friction into those processes, all that happens is all those bad practices go underground and they become less visible. And you end up with all these kind of hidden data factories across the organization.
Yeah,
where
which
people
is what you want to avoid.
Well, we won't go to this guy because he's just going to tell us that we can't do this, and or we need to follow this process which takes 3 months, and I can get the data from here, we can put it in an Excel spreadsheet, and we'll build our own.
But that's a very
solution.
big challenge that all the companies actually face.
Yeah. And it happens, right? And I think that's, historically, that's always been an issue. And I think, particularly with new kind of data programs being initiated, there's often an assumption that, data is not managed. Nothing's happening. When reality, it is happening. It's happening all over the organization. It's just not happening in a coordinated or repeatable fashion. And I think that's your role as a data practitioner is to bring, some degree of order and kind of repeatability to those types of processes, right? So breaking down those silos and trying to get people to collaborate. And for me, that's much more what data enablement is around. It's about understanding the needs of different parts of the organization and understanding that you've all got common goals, right? You're all trying to make the organization more profitable, and you're all pushing towards a set of strategic objectives. And I think that's a key bit for me, is you always need to understand what the organization's trying to accomplish, right? Your role from a data perspective is to enable the organization to get there, right? And I think if you take that kind of mindset, it's a much easier sell to parts of the business. We're here to help you get to where you need to be, right? Your success is our success, right? That's the key bit for me.
So then how do you put that in place when you start? Because you were saying, and I think it's a very interesting point, the other functions were starting as well.
Yeah.
But I guess most of them knew more or less where they were at one point, where they were going. But so what will be the right process if we had to give high-level steps to start and make sure that they feel you're part of the same team, you have the same objectives, and that you set the right things up? So
in a lot of cases, it's building those relationships and listening to people.
Yes.
I think there's not enough of that. I think, you often get too caught up in what you're trying to do, whether that's, getting obsessed with what technology needs to be in place, or, what fantastic things we can do with the data. If that doesn't align to what the business are trying to do, then it's meaningless, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of the kind of groundwork is working with stakeholders to understand what it is they're trying to accomplish.
And it helps you draft your roadmap, I believe, as well, right? So to
of
see
course.
What sort of use cases or product you have to start with.
Yeah, and then I think, like I say before, before you start implementing tools and technologies, it's really around having that core set of principles, understanding capability-wise what it is you need to be able to do before you start, putting technology names in boxes. Understand what it is you're capability-wise trying to do, and why you're trying to do that. I think that's it's a useful tactic to take a lot where you're doing things. Is just reminding yourself why you're doing them.
Yeah.
Because again, you can get obsessed with
like a technology or an AI tool that you absolutely need to have.
Yeah. And I see a lot of organizations still making those mistakes where they're focused on a particular technology, or we need to be doing this because everyone else is doing it.
But you were saying you need to start with a problem, so
it's a common thing where a lot of organizations start with a solution,
yes,
and they're looking for a problem. Right?
That's
it's a simple thing, but it's something that keeps happening and happening. And I think it's hype, and yes, it's trying to keep up with your neighbors and being able to do things. But at the end of the day, you need to understand why you're doing that. Like, how does that contribute to the organization's strategic objectives? Right.
So what was your because what is interesting is that the data function, I mean, you started working before the product itself was launched, before the bank was live, so you had time to prepare a few things. But then for you, what was I don't know what happened or not, but ideally, what should you be ready with when the product launches?
Yeah, so it's a number of things. Again, like I say, building capabilities more than kind of the kind of technology solution. So for us, it was around obviously as a bank, you've got multiple parts of the business that each have their own bespoke applications, right? So core banking, compliance, risk, really focusing on kind of the interoperability between those applications, right? Trying to standardize as much as possible how data looks in each of those systems, so that when you come to bring it together, it's easy. It's easier. It's never easy, right?
It's easier.
I think that's definitely one of the challenges is when you're putting multiple applications in place. Obviously, each application has been designed for a particular purpose, has a data model that comes along with it. It has a particular way of doing things. Some are slightly more open and modular than others. So you're sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. But starting from scratch, I think there's certain things that you can get right very quickly, and I think something that legacy organizations really struggle with is how data enters the organization in the first place. So one of the key things for me was really working with the vendors that were implementing applications and saying, how do we ensure that good quality data is entering the organization in the first place, right? So you can be proactive in a lot of those fundamentals.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask is when it comes to quality governance in general, actually, you had to set up some frameworks or good practices. So that was one of the, can you actually implement already most of the policies, if I may say, before it happens? Or you get surprised because you will be like,
you can have a framework of policies. And obviously it's good to have something tangible that you can always point back to. I think the challenge with policies is often once you've written it, it becomes a piece of paper that you
that's why
you put on
I'm
a shelf somewhere and you dust off every time someone asks, what's your policy?
The moment you start collecting the data, it can be quite different than what you imagine.
So. So like I say, I think taking a more kind of principle focused approach is much more sensible. And having those kind of tangible things where you can always come back to and say, this is why we're doing this. So from a data quality perspective, getting it right first time, rather than trying to deal with it halfway down your kind of your landscape. And this is the challenge that, again, legacy organizations have, is that they're constantly having to clean data at different points in the across that life cycle. And the challenge you have with data is well, its strength is that it's an intangible asset, but also its weakness is that it can exist in multiple places at the same time. And if you've got it in more than one place, then you're never entirely sure which is the right source of truth, right? So there are certain things that you can kind of be proactive in. So, for example, one of the kind of fundamentals that we wanted to have in place was a master data solution from the kind of get-go.
Okay.
So kind of proactively deal with the ability to get data from multiple sources and consolidate it into a golden source proactively. Was something that was quite important as well. And again, that comes from kind of legacy experience, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
with
that
what banks really traditionally have difficulty with, which is understanding the customer. Right? It sounds basic, but a lot of organizations really struggle with that.
Still it's difficult.
Yeah, and now that you're moving into kind of more advanced use cases where you talked about earlier, like the kind of personalization of things, right? You can't do that if you've got multiple views of the same customer, right? Or, you've got accounts sitting in multiple applications. So you need to be able to build those kind of trusted sources quite quickly and ensure that the organization is able to trust those sources.
Can you share with us a few good practices? It could be things that you have implemented or that you didn't. Actually, it's interesting as well. You don't have to say which one was a success or not, but of like, if you take the whole data supply chain, really for you, like the no-brainers that have to be put in place, it could be you were talking about master data management or data catalog, or things that for you are really like a no-brainer to manage the data in this entire life cycle.
Yeah. So I think the key thing you said there was supply chain. I think, again, it's something that kind of legacy organizations really struggle with, is that understanding that you have a data supply chain.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people kind of lose focus on that, right? Data enters your organization, and then there's a number of different supplier-consumer relationships across the organization. And for me, really getting to understand that supply chain is key. Really understanding the different layers to that. Who is it that's producing data? What happens to it? Who's then consuming it? And putting those two people together to have a conversation is massively valuable, right? Often in organizations, you've got someone that creates data down here, then there's a series of processes that happen, and then someone consumes it, and they've got no visibility, or both parties have no visibility of each other, and they're trusting that these guys are doing something, and what often transpires is that the data is not really fit for purpose for consumption, and they have to do some cleanup, and it becomes a cottage industry of things. Really understanding those supply chains is massively valuable for an organization. And those supply chains, they can take on various different forms, right? You've got the technology piece, so the kind of lineage between systems, but you've also got the business aspects of that. And I think it's being able to understand the different layers of those chains and have that well documented is massively valuable. And I think, yes, it takes time to do that up front, but I think if you're able to do things like that, it makes you much more agile and much quicker to deliver things to market later when it comes to it, because you've got a better understanding of where impact is, where change is going to impact different stakeholders. And I think, again, from a legacy perspective, that's what organizations really struggle with. Okay. They're trying to do use cases at this part of the organization, but they've no understanding of where that data comes from and what happens to it along the way. And then something changes upstream and it breaks everything downstream, because there's not been those relationships at first haven't been identified, and those conversations haven't been had. So a lot of problems can just be solved by really mediating the kind of relationships between supply and consumption.
Yeah, very clear. Okay, makes sense. And if we go more into like the use cases, products part of the job, because that was part of all your mandates, I believe, or at least the more recent one. In this case, I wanted to know, like, I guess, so we can discuss about fintech products or like in banking, usually what are the no-brainer use cases that you or in general that we should set up like use cases that you think are really basics when it comes to, it could be customer interfacing or any internal use cases. Can you share with us a few use cases that work pretty well and that should be considered?
We've covered maybe a couple of them. Obviously, personalization is a big piece, and I think that's where organizations are really trying to get to, is, you know, that building a bank for one. Is kind of the end game for a lot of organizations, right? It's almost it's like getting back to that traditional branch bank manager knowing
everything about
you and having that kind of personal relationship, right? It's getting back to that, but in a scalable, more efficient kind of real-time set of services.
Sorry, So what do you put under this personalization hat? There is it could be like basically the, because it's for an online bank, for example, or even when you were back at Fab, but like it can be a bot or like basically an AI you're talking to as like customer service, or is it just personalization in the app?
I think that it's a difficult question. Obviously, my focus areas are much more from a kind of data competency perspective. But for me, I can see where businesses struggle with still trying to define what that looks like in terms of capabilities, right? I think the default is banks going back to a better chatbot, right? Which, yes, ticks some boxes, but it's fairly limited. And again, for me, the challenge with a lot of that is that, you know, if you're not building that on a solid set of foundations, then it can go wrong very, very quickly, right? So particularly customer experience, you know, it doesn't take much for you to have a bad experience, right?
That's very true.
Going back to the aspects of kind of not understanding a customer, you know, if you've got data sitting in another application that you haven't filtered into your, you know, your trusted golden source, and the customer asks a question about something, and your bot doesn't have that visibility, right? Suddenly, that whole your whole trust in that service is now shot, right? And that takes a lot of building back up. So I think there are a lot of challenges in getting that kind of stuff right. For me, some of the use cases are not necessarily kind of customer focusing ones. I think where a lot of banks are getting more value is focusing on those fundamentals. So applying more advanced techniques to some of the traditional kind of data management practices, right? So, you know, we talked about data cataloging. So particularly being able to document the supply chain piece more from a kind of semantic level, I think is going to become much more critical for organizations. Historically, things like data cataloging have been quite a manual task, right? And I think that's why a lot of organizations really struggle with it.
Yes.
And I think being able to apply newer technologies to some of those kind of historic legacy challenges is a smarter way to spend that time. Yes, it's important to do a lot of the kind of customer experience stuff, but you know, really, if you haven't got those kind of fundamentals in place, it's going to be really difficult to do. But also the quality, the end product is not going to be there.
Yeah, and
so
that's
why for me, selfishly, I think it's you know, applying some of those those solutions to some legacy issues is a much smarter way of tackling things. Yeah,
because anyway, that's the most of the time. Like, I don't have any figures in mind, but when you start, you want to launch a use case, you want to build a use case, you'll go through POC, etc. You'll industrialize. Most of the time, when it fails, it's because the foundations were not there, right?
It's because the data is not available or it's not in a fit state to be used. And I think, you know, the classic statistic is that, you know, 80% of the effort of any, you know, data science or, you know, those types of use cases, 80% is in getting the data in a fit shape, and then 20% in actually delivering the value and the product at the end. So the more you can do to chip away at that 80% up front is going to have massive rewards.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of organizations really struggle, is that they're trying to do that glossy, shiny end product because that's what's being measured, right?
Of course.
How many POCs have we done? How many Yeah, but how many of those POCs have actually made it into production and are giving you value? So I think often the kind of metrics are wrong in terms of how those things are being managed, and a lot of people are trying to run before they're able to walk. So for me, for sure, spending the time on those fundamentals, and really embedding solid data management practices into your overall landscape is much more valuable, and it will give you much more value in the longer run.
And so I know it's a difficult question, but that's something we discuss a lot on this podcast, is like, how do you actually show the value? And the reason why, I'll explain to you why I'm asking the question. It's usually I noticed that like we have a lot of issues getting, let's say, teams, budgets, showing the value, showing that the data team in general is can help you get profits. It's not only a cost center, we discussed it. And so when you set up, so one strategy will be to like set up as many use cases as possible, so you can try to show like some impact on business KPIs.
Yeah.
The thing is, as you said, it takes a lot of time to put the foundations in place, and it takes time. It's very difficult to show the value of this.
Yeah.
So what's the strategy? Like, how do you convince? Obviously, it depends on the management, but like, how do you show the value of this, of spending time on the right foundations, putting money in the right tools? How do you show this value? I don't think there is a perfect answer.
Yeah, for sure. There's not a perfect answer. I'm not going to give you a perfect answer. It's challenging, and I think like you say, every organization's different and has different interpretations of where value's being added and how that can be quantified.
Yeah.
I think that you rightly say, I think data functions in particular are often seen as cost centers rather than revenue generating. And I think any CDO that comes into an organization, their end game is to really push towards revenue generation, right? But that's a long journey.
Yeah.
More often than not, you're stuck firefighting issues in the organization, which leaves little time for kind of pushing the agenda for revenue generation. But I think what's important to realize is that you can monetize data in multiple ways, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be direct revenue generation. I think a lot of value comes from building efficiencies in the kind of back and middle office, right? But to be able to quantify that means you need to be able to have things well understood, right? So, like we talked before about really understanding what does value mean to the business, right? So what are their objectives? What is it they're trying to achieve?
Yeah.
And you aligning yourself with those objectives and saying, right, here's how I deliver value to push the needle towards you meeting your objectives. If you can tangibly quantify that kind of value add, and
then it helps.
It helps massively. But also being able to introduce those kind of efficiencies in terms of cost saving and just speed to market, right? So we talked before, again, chipping away at that 80% of where effort is spent in cleaning up data, and if you can quantify a lot of that, so you can say, look, POCs were taking X amount of time previously. We know a lot of that was spent on getting data, cleaning data. We've now managed to reduce that so that you're able to do that much more quickly, and there's a much more trust in ensure the data is fit for a particular purpose. That helps a lot as well. And yes, there's going to be times where it's hard to tangibly put numbers on things, but I think again, if you can really understand those supply chains and you're able to articulate, I think again, it's I keep coming back to that because I think it's a very useful tactic for getting everyone to the table to understand how their bit contributes to the full chain, right? So you bring technology to the table, you can bring business to the table. You've got something tangible that you can talk around, right? And you're able to connect the business side with the technology side, with the data side. And you really understand how each of those interdependencies work. I think if you've got something like that, it's much really easier to say, look, here's where the impact of this particular issue is. And you're much closer to being able to kind of put a tangible value on that impact.
Okay.
But it takes hard work and it takes collaboration between different stakeholders. Right? You're as a data function, you're not best placed to understand tangibly how something's impacting the business. Right? You need the business to help you quantify that.
Yeah, you can't do everything on your own anyway. In the data team in general,
and I think that
it's nonsense.
And some of the challenges I see CDOs having is that, and it's something we've discussed before, is that I think a lot of organizations assume that by having a CDO, it solves a lot of their problems, right? Yeah. And the CDO is going to come in and do magic, and suddenly they don't need to worry about data anymore because it's their responsibility. Yeah. And that's not how it works, right? Yeah,
but it's good to say it. That is not how it works.
Yeah, it's good to say it. And that's a lot of education for senior management as well, that you can't just hand responsibility of data to someone else in the organization. Right? That's not how it works.
No, because it takes so much transformation as well. Transformation cannot come from a single team. Like it has to be from the top, from everyone in the organization.
Yeah, and it's like I say, it's hard work, right?
It is.
It's hard work.
Yeah, I can see the experience.
Yeah.
Is there any innovation that you're personally keeping an eye on, like in fintech in general, in banking, or any AI, any technology, anything that you're like seeing as a big that has a big potential?
For me, again, from a selfish perspective, a lot of what I'm looking at is how we can speed up and augment the kind of traditional foundational practices from a data management perspective. Again, the challenges a lot of those kind of programs have is that there's still quite a lot of manual effort involved in getting data into a fit shape for consumption, right? Particularly on the cataloging side, and being able to align kind of business definitions to physical implementations of databases and things is historically tricky to do. Yeah. And like I say, for the advancement of kind of more advanced AI use cases, things like that are going to become super powerful for organizations. If you're able to add as much context and as much standardization to your data assets as possible, you can then use that data as an asset for these use cases in a much more efficient way. I think the challenge is that there's an overarching perception that AI is magic, right? And it's easy to apply AI to any use case and suddenly it works, right? Yeah. And I think that's been it's been a recurring theme in technology data where you go through these hype cycles. We've seen it before with big data, machine learning, data science, cloud. These hype cycles continue. I think what makes the AI piece different is that it's really something that's become much more tangible to anyone in the organization, right? Anyone can open ChatGPT and start playing around with their own use cases, which kind of gives this overconfidence that it's an easy thing to do, right? I did something last night and, I was able to feed all this information in and get answers out. So why can we not do that in our organization, right? Course. And obviously there's a difference between doing that at that level and, building something that is robust, secure, scalable, all of these problems. So managing those kind of expectations in those use cases is going to be a challenge for a lot of kind of data and tech functions. Managing kind of expectations at the senior management level as to what's possible and what's doable, and coming back to that discussion we had around kind of POCs, I think it's very easy to make a POC look
of course,
tangibly valuable and easy to implement, right? And the reality when you come to implement is far from that, right?
Yeah.
A lot of POCs are done in a very sanitized environment with perfect data and happy path, processes, and then you come to put that into the real world, and suddenly,
yes, it's a bit different.
It's a bit different. Yeah. So I think for me, really focusing on kind of the fundamentals and how you make those kind of frictionless within the organization, because no one really wants to do data management, right? Yeah. It's like telling your kids to do their homework. It's
not the sexy part of the job.
It's not the sexy part of the job, no. So anytime that you can apply those types of techniques to those key areas, I think, like I say, for me, they're massive value add. And it might not be immediately tangible, but anyone that's been through the pain of trying to do things at this side and realizing they need to unpick everything all the way back to the source will tell you that that's a valuable thing to do.
I think that's an amazing takeaway. We can finish on this. Thank you so much, Garry, for your time and for all these insights. I think it's clear that we have to focus on foundations, fundamentals.
Yes, I think that's always, principles and the foundations of good data management practices will never go out of fashion, and they'll always be value add.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.